Welcome to Chapter 10, and we're going to be talking about short-term decision making. And this is one of my favorite topics in managerial accounting. This is where a good manager can use data rather than gut instincts for critical short-term decision making. And so we will look at such items as whether or not to accept or reject a special order, whether we're going to make something versus buying it ourselves, a component or something like that, and on. So as I said, what we're going to be talking about is short-term business decisions as opposed to long-term business decisions. So these are going to be of a temporary nature. Are we going to accept a special production order? Determining the best product mix. So if we make two different models of bicycle, the consumer grade and the racing grade, what is the optimal mix of the manufacturing in order to maximize our profits? Are we going to outsource a part or a service? Or I had a friend I remember in college, and her father owned a company. And one of the decisions that they made was that they were going to start to manufacture the packaging that this product that they sold, I don't even remember the product at this point, but the packaging was costing them a fair amount to purchase it. And they discovered that if they made it themselves, not only did they have more control over how much was produced and the timing and availability on all of that, but they were able to do it more efficiently. That isn't always the case, but that's just an example of where it happened to work out. And then, are we going to further process or refine a current product? And perhaps getting into the example of that later will be clearer. And as opposed to what we're not really going to be looking at in this chapter is whether we're going to buy equipment or whether we're going to refurbish an older piece of equipment, decide which products to manufacture, if we're going to add a product segment in another company or a country, excuse me, or purchase another business. So those are topics we won't cover in the short-term decision-making analysis. But before we get into the analysis, there's some really important vocabulary that I want to touch on. So the first is avoidable cost. And an avoidable cost is something that will go away. It's a cost that we're not going to have if we choose, alternative A versus alternative B, for example. So maybe alternative A means that we buy from a supplier that is right next door to us, therefore we pay no shipping costs, versus do we buy from the wholesaler across town or on the other side of the country that might charge us less, but there might be pretty substantial shipping costs that go along with that. On the other hand, the opposite to that, there are the unavoidable costs, which are the costs that we will incur whether or not we choose alternative A or alternative B. Sunk costs is possibly the most important term that we will talk about this term, and really it comes up in management decisions over and over and over again. And I would say that this is probably the in terms of rookie management mistakes, calculating sunk costs into any analysis, as tempting as it may be, is one of those mistakes that will always lead a manager down the wrong path. And what do I mean by that? I mean that evaluating a decision based on what we've already spent. In other words, those costs have already been incurred. They are sunk. So changing course at this point isn't going to stop us from, we're not going to recover those costs. They are gone, it's over with. And where I hear this come up a lot is when a business will take a certain course of action and they get midway through and it starts to appear as though the course of action that they've taken might not be a prudent one. And they're really reluctant to abandon it at that point because they've invested a lot in it at that point. And so they look at what they invested in it, and they just somehow hope that if they keep going, they will recover some of the sunk costs that they've invested, rather than just recognizing that those costs have already been spent. Let's not risk losing any more or wasting any more time on a losing proposition. We need to just scrap it and move on to something different. Future costs or revenue that do not differ. So if we are going to add something or take on a special order, and this is in no way going to change any future costs that we're going to be incurring. For example, if we're evaluating whether or not to take on a special order, when we're looking at the costs of that, we're not going to be looking at things that we're already going to be spending, whether or not we take this product on, whether, we're not going to be thinking about our insurance or our rent unless we've got to rent more space or, increase our insurance costs because of this. So if things that are not going to be different as a result of this analysis, we're going to disregard. And lastly, opportunity costs. The concept of opportunity costs assumes that we don't have the capacity to accept every opportunity that comes our way. For me, I'm a lawyer. I can only be in one court at one time. And so if I choose to take case A, and that case runs lots of court time and means that I can't take 3 other cases, then I need to calculate not just what I'm going to earn from case A, but what I'm giving up by not taking cases B, C, and D. Because I have taken case A. And so the analysis of the cases B, C, and D that I'm not taking, those would be referred to lost opportunity costs. And so this is just an example that I'm not going to go through. All right. So another analysis that I referred to earlier, which I said might not make a bunch of sense, is whether we would continue to further manufacture a product. And this is an example from a coffee shop. And they've got to decide what they're going to do with their grounds. Now, they could throw the grounds away or, put them in their composter, as we're now required to do in Vermont, or they could sell those to a company that will process them into fertilizer, or maybe they even develop their own process for packaging and selling the fertilizer. So the coffee shop's got to now do this analysis of the relevant costs associated with processing that item further, and versus what they could get for selling it. And the costs associated with getting it ready for sale versus what if they just don't incur the costs and they just throw it out the back door. I'm actually going to move on to the next video to talk about special orders.